Hi, everybody, and welcome back to World Wildlife Journeys. And today we've got a guest who's a very good friend of mine, lives just down the road in Wilderness, about an hour's drive from me. His name is Tim Carr. He's also a professional guide, also does tours all over Southern and East Africa. He's a very well-respected ornithologist. But I didn't want to invite him on today to talk about birds. We might talk about birding at another time. Tim and I had a really fascinating conversation a couple of weeks ago about bees and beekeeping. So Tim literally has his beekeeping hat on today, or he just took it off because he's just captured a swarm, and he's come to talk to us about something that you may know about. You've seen it in the news, a phenomenon known as colony collapse disorder, CCD. This is where a whole colony of bees, for reasons that we don't yet fully understand, collapses, and most of the worker bees just take off and abandon the hive. So, Tim, welcome. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day. I hope you didn't get stung earlier.
Thanks, Russell. I did. I got about 6 stings this time. That tends to go with the territory out here, I'm afraid. But we've had a great morning. It's been an odd year for us with the bees. You know, we normally hear opposite to how a lot of the folks in the US would know. Here we tend to harvest in what for them would be the middle of winter. Here, obviously, for us, it's the middle of summer. And we normally start harvesting from about the 10th of December. And children's teachers at the end of the year are gifted bottles of honey to thank them for their year of putting up with Aiden and Tyler. And this year we didn't have any. And this has been the first harvest of the summer. So in effect, we're running almost 2 months behind schedule, which is very odd. And it's still not a very big harvest, but we are starting to harvest. And then ironically, about 15 minutes before you and I started our conversation, I had a swarm split and move into one of my empty boxes. So I've been running around frantically trying to deal with a brand new swarm, as well as managing the extraction. But so far this morning we've taken out about 40 pounds worth of honey. So far so good. It's the bees we're dealing with here, obviously, as well, very different to the bees that a lot of your viewers might be familiar with, which we'll chat about a little bit in a moment.
Yeah, Tim and I were kidding about this before we came on air, and I said to him, I have this little joke whenever I'm on safari, and if you see a swarm of bees go past, I say to people, "Oh, look, there goes a swarm of African killer bees," or as we call them, bees, because we're just so used to dealing with these things. And they are, they are aggressive, and they will go after you. I mean, all of us as kids had experiences where, a swarm of bees went after, and you just know what to do. You head for the nearest water and try and get in the water as quickly as you can. And it doesn't matter if that water's got crocodiles or whatever in, boy, if there's a swarm of bees after you in the Zambezi Valley, you don't even look left, you don't look right, you just jump in and take your chances with the crocodiles, because, man, it's not worth sticking around for.
Yeah. So the kind of bee that you would have grown up with as a kid in Zimbabwe is slightly different to ours. The honeybee down here in the Cape is a different subspecies. It's Apis mellifera capensis as opposed to Apis mellifera scutellata. And the capensis bee is a little bit more relaxed. But just to give you a comparison, if you looked at the Western or the European honeybee, which is the honeybee that's in North America, our honeybee is 3 to 4 times more likely to attack and will chase you a lot further. The venom is exactly the same. The venom amount that they'll give you, everything is exactly the same, but they're just 3 or 4 times more aggressive. And that's possibly because there are just more things here that would have raided them historically. If you look at things like honey badgers, if you look at monkeys, baboons, all of that. This is probably all an evolutionary tactic to deal with that.
I was just about to say it's probably the honey badger's fault.
Yeah. And if you look at it from a evolutionary point of early hominids, our ancestors would have been harvesting honey for probably 2+ million years. If you do those trips through Olduvai Gorge, and you see those early hominids, those chaps would have been hunting bees in one form or another. I was taking the honey out this morning, and I was chatting to the chap who I'm busy mentoring at the moment, and we were discussing that the intensity of that sweetness is just something that would have been unbelievable in our ancestors. We all know we've got a sweet
tooth. That raises a really interesting question, and I've never even contemplated this before. But are chimps known to go after beehives?
Yeah, they are, and baboons.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So I think in the forest as well, you probably find. I mean, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are almost 3,000 species of bees. A lot of those are stingless. Now, again, as a youngster, you would have probably encountered the Mapani bees, which are those sweat bees that are so annoying when you're walking through the Mapani felt, and they go for the eyes, and they go for your perspiration. And they're a stingless bee, but they also make honey. Now, there are a lot of other types of bees aside from just the honey bees, and I don't know what they are, but in those Central African rainforests, there will be many types of solitary bee that'll nest in tree cavities and things like that. And certainly the chimps would go for that.
Well, I mean, they're certainly very happy to eat insects and fishing for termites and all of that stuff. So, I mean, as much as they would crave the honey, they would probably be just as happy eating the comb with the grubs as well. It's a good source of protein.
The larva, exactly. And interesting you say that, because if you read some of the early writings, for example, the writings of Bleak and Lloyd, who were interviewing some of the Bushmen that were interned on the early breakwaters, building the Cape Harbor. One of the most sought after aspects for the Bushmen up in the Northern Cape and southern Botswana was actually the grubs of the bees. They relished that as much. And so for our ancestors as well, that protein source would have been a perfect fix. So you got the sweetness, plus you got the protein simultaneously. It really was a complete package. You would have had your fats, your proteins, and your sugars all together.
Yeah, no wonder we took.
The other one that's interesting. There's talking about we were looking at birds earlier. And you've probably had it on safari, and I'm sure you've encountered it with guests before. But when you have an encounter with a greater honey guide, which is I'll just describe it for people listening. But it's a fascinating little bird, a little bit bigger than a sparrow, beautiful white outer tail feathers, and he throughout summer he's got a very loud ringing Victor call that you hear throughout southern and East Africa as you drive through various forms of acacia savanna, and his Latin name is indicator, which points to his importance in our relationship with him, and that, as the common name as well indicates, he will guide people to where beehives are. And they're a very interesting bird, because not many birds have got a sense of smell, but honey guides have got a phenomenal sense of smell, and they use that to locate comb, because one of the things they eat is wax. They're one of the few vertebrates that can actually process wax, and they cannot access a hive without either humans or, as you said earlier, honey badgers opening up a hive to make it available for them. So they've developed this other call that sounds much like a box of matches being shaken, and it's the sort of call, and they'll lead you to a hive expecting you to open it. You take what you want, and in exchange, they then access some of the leftovers. There are a couple of researchers linked at the moment through Cambridge University working up in Nyasa, which is in northern Mozambique. And what they found there, it's a huge national park right up on the border with Tanzania, is that in various parts of the park, the honey guides have developed a different linguistic code with the different communities of honey hunters that live within the national park. So in other words, honey guides in the north will respond to a call equivalent to say, honey guide, I'm looking for honey. And in the south, in a completely different region, the way of summoning a honey guide there is actually to walk through the bush, hitting a tree with a machete, or just shouting honey, honey, honey. And they've learned to associate the different language code with the different groups. So there's become this almost cultural linguistic bond between the various communities of these honey guides.
It's like Pavlov's dogs. They've been conditioned to respond to that call.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is a fascinating thing,
yeah.
because I don't know in nature of any other symbiotic relationship between, you know, a bird and a honey badger, or a bird and humans. And it's just also, you know, for our listeners, you know, we grow up in Africa, and the stories about honey guides are legendary. You know, and one of the very, very strong myths is that, you know, if you do not leave a portion of comb for the honey guide at the end of the day, then that honey guide will lead the next person to disaster. They'll lead them to a poisonous snake, or they will lead them to a wounded buffalo, and this is a persistent myth. And I got to tell you a story of a friend of mine who was working in Mavoradona and got this honey guide chasing him around. So he set off following it, and this thing led him straight to a group of poachers. And after my friend had disarmed them and arrested them, he was searching through their belongings, and he found a honeycomb. So these guys, this is true story. So these guys had hit the hive. They'd taken all the honeycomb for themselves, left nothing for the bird. The bird went and found another person who had a rifle and said, "Come with me. There's some guys over here with spears.
Come dish out some karma."
Call it karma, call it what you like. My friend swears by that story. He says, "Yeah." He said, "True story. That's what happened to me." So you know.
We all grew up with Jock of the Bushveld as a kid's book, and you would have, you know, as well. And the first encounter most of us have with honey guides is in Jock of the Bushveld, where he talks exactly about that myth. And I always did think it was slightly allegorical, and until the first honey guide led me to a beehive, and it took me straight there. And I haven't had a lot of it. I've only had it about 4 times, but each time infallibly it's taken me directly to a beehive, which raises a very interesting conundrum, if you like, when you are in a protected area and this bird leads you to a hive, and now you don't respond by opening the hive because you're in a protected area. In effect, over time, we are breaking that contract that we've developed over the last couple of million years with this bird. And there are very few parts of Africa, certainly Southern Africa, where communities will still have a close relationship with this honey guide. It really is quite remarkable. And it's a shame.
But the badgers are still doing their job.
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, very much so. I mean, they are...
Tell us a little bit about trying to produce badger-friendly honey in South Africa. And guys, if you're living in America, you got to understand that when we say a honey badger, this is not like those things that hang around in England. This thing is like a wolverine.
I think wolverine.
It's a wolverine, right?
Yeah.
So this is not like a...
With a raccoon's brain.
Yeah, and a skin like a Sherman tank. But so how ingenious are these things? What have you tried to keep them out of your hives?
What I'm going to suggest, if there's a phenomenal YouTube video I recommend, and this is not an endorsement for this establishment or anything.
I'll include a link to that video
for Stoffel the honey badger.
Yeah, below. If you guys look in the
give you some idea of what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
So just as an example, all our hives have got to be pole mounted at least 4 feet off the ground. So when you're working with your beehives, you're working with them at chest height. Any lower than that, and the honey badger will figure out how to get onto them. My hives are all 4 feet off the ground. They're ratchet strapped with ratchet tie downs to hold them down. And occasionally I'll get there and still our resident honey badger has figured out how to get up there, remove a ratchet strap that is so tight I cannot shift the ratchet, and he'll still manage to pop it, get the lid off, and scatter the bees. They're incredible. When I first started, where in the area that you and I live now, which ironically is known as Otaniqua land, or the land of people bearing much honey, by the early Bushmen people, again indicating the importance of honey. I put I had 2 hives. I put my 2 hives out, very proud, new beekeeper, and they were on the stands, and I thought, well, I'm going to protect them from the wind. I'm going to put them in the lee of the shrub, and that way they won't get too stirred by the strong northwester winds that we get coming through. Well, blow me down. About 6 weeks later, I get there to do my first hive inspection, and these hives are absolutely trashed. All the combs out, the swarm's dead, the lid's gone. And looking at the tracks, what we figured out, what the honey badger had done is he had climbed the adjacent shrub until such time as the shrub bent enough to effectively paratroop him onto the top of the hive. He said, "Thank you very much. I'll take these," and cleaned them both out. So they really are. I mean, they're incredible animals, and it's sorted out now because in the early days, what people would do is they would just gin trap or shoot the honey badgers. And we've had some phenomenal successes with WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, teaching apiarists and beekeepers about putting them up on stands and starting a program known as bee friendly honey, or badger friendly honey rather. And that's been driven by consumers, and that's been a very successful program to educate apiarists and consumers about the importance of not killing the honey badgers in exchange for buying a slightly more expensive honey. And certainly all the beekeepers I know, there are still some that don't, but the vast majority of beekeepers now are quite conscientious about looking after their honey badgers. And that leads to another one. It's fascinating. Talking about branding and consumerism and how that drives changes in practices. You and I were discussing the other day the problems with elephants and communities in Zambia and Zimbabwe, Tanzania, countries that we spend a lot of time. And for a lot of these communities, the perception and the way wildlife is viewed is very different to the way we do it, to the way our guests do when they're on safari, because when you're living with elephants and they're a very real threat to your livelihood and in fact your life, it's a problem. It's a problem that weighs 5.5 tons, and there's not much you can do to shift it once it decides it wants your groundnut crop. And very successfully, what people have started doing is using bees as a way to keep elephants out of the crops, because most young elephants at some point or other will push over a tree or break off a branch that hosts a wild swarm. And that swarm will attack the elephant. And the way bees tend to find you is through your carbon dioxide emissions, which means they sting the elephant in the tip of the trunk and inside the trunk, which is an incredibly sensitive organ for the elephant.
Yeah.
And it's excruciatingly painful for them. And they learn the sound of a bee swarm, the smell of a bee swarm, and they tend to keep clear. So by strategically placing hives around your fields, you now have an additional cash crop in the form of honey, and you have a system that is not completely foolproof, but is effectively foolproof. All you have to do now is figure out how to keep the honey badgers out as well.
Yeah, it's
but they take honey like that and market it.
Yeah, it's something that I always marvel at. If you're in Africa, you see the havoc that's been wreaked by the humble bunny rabbit, you know, imported from England into Australia, dropped off there, and in 30 seconds flat, it's created absolute havoc within the landscape. And I always say to people, if you bring a bunny rabbit from England and drop it off in Africa, there's like 50 things queuing up to eat it on its first night. So we don't struggle with that invasive species. And that's actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you about, because I was reading some research, and one of the things that they've raised as a possible specter for this colony collapse disorder is the Varroa mite and the infestation. So this is a mite that's evolved alongside the bees of Southeast Asia. It's now been imported into America, and it's now found its way to Africa, landing here in South Africa. Now, our bees have mites that they live alongside with and what have you. I'm interested to get your take on, because the research that I've read seems to indicate that the natural, because we have so many wild swarms, that there will be this selection process that'll happen. The Varroa mite's going to get into the wild population, but very quickly those that are more susceptible to it will collapse, and those that are not will actually replicate and split. And so what's going to happen, because we've got a natural system, is a natural form of immunity is going to develop just through simple Darwinian evolution. Whereas in a place like America, where most of the hives are cultivated, they're trying to save all of the bees, and as a result, they're not getting natural selection actually working in their favor. Would you agree with that?
That's exactly right. You know, if you look at Germany, for example, 99% plus of Germany's bees live in man-made boxes for honey production. We have the opposite case. We only have about 3% of our bees live in boxes. The vast majority are still living in the mountains, in the forest, in holes in the ground. You know, and that does lead to a much stronger, more resistant bee. We don't have a Varroa mite issue in Southern Africa, and we're incredibly fortunate. And you know, it is a huge problem in other parts of the world. But exactly as you say, something in the way our bees have selectively bred has allowed them to be resistant to it. And in fact, we don't have a lot of the issues with colony collapse disorder either, which is a huge problem in North America and a little bit in South America becoming, and in Europe. I mean, guys are talking sometimes as much as 90% of their hives just absconding and disappearing, and they don't know what's happening to them. And you know, the interesting one is, for a long time, the neonicotinoids pesticides were being banned and were being blamed, and were then being banned through Europe. There was the ban on Bayer and you know, some of their pesticides and herbicides in Europe, which has been quite controversial. And rightly or wrongly, I think the jury's still out on that, but it probably does have some impact on them. And you know, possibly what we're finding is it's not any one chemical, but it's the cocktail of chemicals that our bees are exposed to when they're visiting the 5,000 flowers for that day. And it's the cumulative effect of the 18 different pesticides that they're picking up. Any one pesticide on its own may well be fine, but the cocktail combined may well be what the problem is. But I think more likely is just the mass industrialization of the bee industry that we're seeing worldwide, where you know we're picking bees up, we're trucking them, we're moving them all over the world or all over the country. Bees don't like that. They like to stay where they get put.
The diet of them is also significant, because you've basically put them on a diet of one sort of pollen, you know, whereas they used to, I mean, a bee should ideally be eating you know, a huge cross section of pollen.
Exactly.
And this thing of just taking them and plonking them down in an almond plantation and just saying, this is it, guys, you're going to eat almond pollen for the next 6 months. That cannot be good for any creature.
No, it's definitely going to weaken the swarms, and then, you know, to then keep them going, to just give them a sugar and pollen patty just to keep them going, that's also not enough. Exactly as you say, you know, the whole way we farm has got to change. The fact that we're ripping up the hedgerows, the wildflowers, what most of us would consider weeds, where we're growing crops increasingly that can be sprayed with these incredibly powerful pesticides or herbicides and are resistant to it, but the weeds are all being obliterated. Those weeds were all a massively important food source for the bees. I mean, here in the Western Cape where we live, we're incredibly fortunate. We've got an unbelievable floral diversity. I mean, we're sitting with about 9,500 species of flowering plant. So our bees can feed on a tremendous variety of pollen and in fact nectar, which is as much important for them. And it's very interesting because a lot of the beekeepers in this area are totally reliant on imported Australian eucalyptus trees, the gum trees in one form or another, quite possibly the same in the United States, in the more southern parts of the states. And they are a fantastic crop for bees. But I think a lot of the beekeepers in South Africa have become overly reliant on the eucalyptuses and tend to forget that the Cape honeybee has been here for probably in excess of 60 million years in you know, in one landform or another, as they've shifted and changed. And they were certainly here many millions of years before eucalyptuses arrived. And the honeybees, I think, often sometimes a hands-off approach, a more natural way of beekeeping, also leads to stronger swarms. I don't think there are many places in the world we can say that you've got an organic honeybee, because the way they range and the way they forage, they just cover such a big distance. But a more natural, more holistic way of beekeeping, you know, for me, I tend, if I look for honey, one of the first things I look for is whether it's a single source. In other words, you know, are these bees that stay only on one site, or are they picked up and moved?
Okay, so
if they're picked up and moved, it tends to be that they're used for pollination.
Okay, so just explain this now. You're saying that the concept of organic honey is something of a marketing gimmick, because you cannot actually say that these bees have only, you know, my bees have been trained, they do not go into the eucalyptus plantation. That's not going to happen. But what you are saying is for consumers, what they should look for is a single source. This is in honey terms, this is the equivalent of a single malt whiskey. This is not a blend.
Or exactly. This is a straight Cabernet Sauvignon from one specific terroir, and this is as good as it gets in terms of red wine.
This is like, I don't like your honey when you bottle it, you don't get some other stuff from China and put that in, and some other stuff from Australia and put that in. You just bottling what your bees.
This is exactly this is exactly the problem, because, and I think it works the same in the United States, is for example, you can't bring honey in from China, but you can bring honey in from Argentina. So China will send its honey via Argentina to the United States. And as long as it comes in bulk and is then bottled and packaged there, it can be a product of South Africa or a product of the United States. It doesn't necessarily mean it comes solely from the United States or from South Africa. And that is a huge problem in South Africa. People will buy honey that they think is South African, but if you look at it, it's maybe from South Africa and or China and or India and or Argentina.
I actually saw a documentary on this, and there was a bit of a horror story, because the stuff coming out of China was not honey. Spoiler alert.
No. Well, I saw something the other day in the supermarket down the road from me, and it was being marketed as honey syrup. And I looked at this, and it contains about 3% honey. The rest is sugar syrup. And it caught my eye because it was so ridiculously cheap. It was about a third of the price of what a normal bottle of honey would cost. And I looked at that because there's just no way any beekeeper would sell their honey for that price. And it's the first time I've ever seen anything being marketed so openly as honey syrup. That was a new one for me. It's no, and I think, Russell, it's so often the case of farming, of eggs, of chickens, of honey. If you know your producer, develop a relationship with your supplier, develop a relationship with a local beekeeper, develop a relationship with a local family down the road who keep chickens and sell the excess eggs. Get a relationship with the permaculture chaps down the road, and have accountability. Have it that you can actually visit the apiary, visit the chicken run, whatever, because if they're not scared to show you it, it means they're not hiding anything. It means they're producing a quality product. And then, conversely, be prepared to pay for it. I think half the problem often with these things is the fact that the consumers aren't willing to pay the extra 20 Rand, 25 Rand, whatever it is, to get a better quality product, which is what keeps those small scale producers, in line.
The moral of the story is buy local.
That's it. Yeah. And come to Africa to taste our honey as soon as you can.
Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. And do me a favor and put my name on one of those bottles of honey. And
I definitely will.
And have a cup of coffee with me next time you're coming into town.
Yeah. Well, I believe Leanne makes good scones. She makes the scones. I'll bring the honey.
I don't know about her making scones, but I'll make you flapjacks, and I make the best damn flapjacks in town.
Thanks, Russell. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, my friend. Ladies and gentlemen,
all right, cheers.
I hope you've enjoyed chatting to Tim and getting his wisdom on bees and everything else. And I certainly hope
something different
weekend. Stay healthy, and I will chat to you all again next week. Thanks for joining us, Tim.
Thanks, Russell. Cheers. All the best. Cheers, folks.